Hey everybody, welcome to Trend Rebel. This is Banana on the One. On the One's a series where we go through a particular ticker on a 1 minute time frame. We check and evaluate how the ticker performed across various pivots that we supply. Today we're going to take a look at Google's chart and on the 1 minute here, and just expand this out a little bit. There we go. So as you can see, active pivots for the day, there were three. We had the 172.72, which was a weekly pivot, a 171.03, which was a monthly pivot, and then a 168.06, which was the bottom of a black hole on a weekly pivot. When we started the day, we gapped up. This is Friday here. Today is Monday. We gapped up to 173.23 roughly. From there, we went up to 174.96 prior to bringing a back test, not to the Friday's close, but to the weekly pivot, which is pretty cool. So you see that back test right to the pivot. After that back test, we bounced up. And then came back and back tested and failed. Then we back tested the pivot again from below, and this time we failed. And where did we go at this point? We went right to the monthly pivot, 171.03, which is right here, this line. After that, we slowly crawled back up to the weekly pivot of 172.72, for which we tested it twice, fell a little bit, and tested it a third time, ultimately losing that pivot, at which point we fell down to the monthly pivot again of 171.03. At 171.03, we fell through. We back tested from below, right here like this, and we failed that back test, at which point Google started to flounder here. It went to the halfway point, which is always a pivot we discuss, but we don't always post them. So we always use around the halfway point between any two pivots is always a good point to take a look at. So we bounced off that halfway point, back up to the pivot, and back tested the 171.03 monthly pivot again. Could not penetrate that. We had some consolidation here where we tested it again. At that test, we finally lost it completely. And what did we do? We shot directly down to the halfway point here, for which we bounced, and then shot directly down to the bottom pivot here, which is the black hole bottom at 168.06. After that, we tried to go back up to the halfway point, lost it, came back down, tested the pivot, tried to go up again, tested the pivot, lost it, regained it, and then we closed the day with a little bit of a spike at the end. So I really want you to take a look and understand how significant this is in terms of planning your day and making a trade. What you had here was a pretty stable pivot right here, this weekly pivot, for which we touched several times. Looks like once, twice, three, 4, 5, 6 times on this shopping cart pivot at the 172.72. So that was a pretty nice play where you could have tested the back test here. If you'd lost that or were nervous about it, you could have let it try to retest it, which was going to the back up, come back down. And at that point, when it penetrated here, because it didn't stop here, if you look at this candle on the 1 minute, there's a 1 minute, so these are fast moving. This went all the way through. You wait for the back test up. The back test failed, right? You breached a little bit, but then ultimately failed. That point in time, you could have shorted or bought puts going down to the 171.03 pivot. So right down to there, you would have exited there, and then you would have looked, since this was a major move, you would have probably let this consolidation happen on its own. Not my recommendation ever to buy immediately after a large move back into a new position, but to let the consolidation occur, even if you know it's going right up to that pivot, which is what it did. So it got here. At this point, when it lost this pivot, you could have shorted here, set your stop loss above, let it come back around on its own. You'd still be in the green here, and wait for that to back test again. Now on this back test here, if we lost the pivot, meaning if price rose above it, then you would have to exit. And again, you set your stop loss something like this. Let me show you here as we teach it during the class. So somewhere right around there. And so since we didn't get up to that point, we didn't lose it. And what this line represents, by the way, is it represents the bodies of these two fallen candles here and the top peak of the first penetration on the back test here. So there's some logic behind that, but we'll go into that another day. Anyway, so on the back test here, so we bought here on the loss, it consolidated, came back up, bounced off it. So since it didn't penetrate our stop loss here, we held that short or put position all the way down to this monthly pivot at the 171.03. At that point in time, you could have exited there or waited and see. So we immediately lost it. So there wasn't a whole lot of gambling to do here. And if you zoom in on your candle here, these two candles on the back test from below, all right, were not higher than the candle from the entry. So you were pretty good to hold on to there. And again, you could have played it exactly the same. So yes, you want to exit, but if you don't want to exit, you play it as if it's a new trade and you set your you set your stop loss. So you go into that trade, you set your stop loss, hold it, essentially eliminating this stop loss. That's now gone. Adding in a new one here. Lost the trade, lost the pivot, bounced back up for the back test. It lost that back test. Came down, consolidated, came down to the halfway point. So this halfway point is a good place to take profit. I know, obviously, since I have the little crystal ball here and can see forward, that ultimately we went down to this pivot. But coming to this halfway point is significant because those halfway points between these major pivots usually tend to bear fruit and become a little riskier as you get close further and further away. Again, the move for the day was all the way here at 175-ish, all the way down to 169.69. So, to 169 at this time. So I would have exited here and looked for what happened next. So right around either at this point or here, this consolidation point or this one, either one would have been fair. And I would have missed this part where it retraced back up to the 171.03 monthly pivot. At which point, when it rejected, I would have considered getting in here, and you could have. Or when we came down, if you can see that the angle of attack here is wallowing a little bit, I probably would have waited it out again. It came up and back test again. On the second back test, I definitely would have entered in here upon losing the pivot. And on this one right here, we went down again to the halfway point and consolidated here. You see that nice little wick coming up here. So this would have been a good place to exit again. So you could have traded your shorts or your puts here through here. Or what you could have done is picked a spot somewhere here through this big wick, which is what I like to see. When you see a giant wick like that, what you can do is you can add a stop loss here, cutting that big wick in half. So kind of the general rule is if we're going to penetrate that big wick coming up, then you want to get out of your position. If you keep this big candle here and you use that as your backstop, then on the halfway pivot, since this isn't a real pivot anyway, we use this one for there. So we can take this out now. Now this is our stop loss here. We're down here. The wick came up, did not grab it. So now on we go. So we go back down to here, which is the black hole bottom at 168.06. Now, significantly, we've gone from one weekly pivot to another through a monthly pivot. So at this point in time, I'm exiting, and I'm going to wait for the consolidation to complete. So we got this back test coming back up. It failed, came back down, hit the pivot. Yes, you could have ranged a little bit here, but this is too hard. I don't want to trade this. There's no reason to. Just let it be. Even though the pivot worked a couple times here, you could have made a couple dollars here and there. It's just not worth it. But the overall, if you look at this with these three pivots, the two weeklies and the monthly in the middle, they set you up very nicely. Don't need these anymore. We made our trade, and we will see what we get tomorrow. So Google traded very well today for through these pivots, and I looked across the board and saw actionable pivots, which we provide for Apple, Meta. MSTRs were huge. Teslas were good. Nvidias were good. SPYs were amazing, especially with the massive fall we had today. Anyway, across the board, everything looked great. But thought I'd pick a new name for you guys to share with you guys today. And don't forget, Trend Rebel offers the most actionable pivots and accurate pivots in the universe, and we are happy to provide them to you guys. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you on the trading floor.